This is not how we're going to kick this off. How we doing, everybody? Buenos dias! Welcome! Welcome to the Aspen Ideas Climate Summit. Now, I'm Mariana Atencio, and I'm deeply honored to be hosting this pivotal event in my hometown. Here in our beloved city of Miami, we don't just bear witness to the effects of climate change, we live through them every single day. And beyond our shores and my work as a former national correspondent at Univision and NBC, I covered natural disasters for over 10 years. And when people find out that I do this work, their first reaction is usually, wow, you must have seen some terrible things. But actually, it's the opposite. It is in the worst of circumstances where I have seen people come together and rise beyond labels and stereotypes and polarization. Standing on this stage today, I am filled with hope. And that hope stems from the resilience and the ingenuity and the passion of the change makers in this room. I come to you today only not as a journalist, but also as a proud Henry Crown Fellow at the Aspen Institute. I fervently believe, thank you so much, that the Aspen Institute is leading the way in the fight against climate change. And today, we're not just here to discuss problems, we are also here to present innovative solutions. We are here to harness the collective wisdom and the creativity of everyone in this auditorium to chart a new course toward a new sustainable planet. You're gonna hear from city planners and activists, from scientists and artists, and every single voice offers a unique perspective and an expertise that they bring to the table, and together we can lead the change. So let's roll up our sleeves and get to work. Let's make sure that we amplify the voices of those most affected. Let's ensure that equity and justice are always at the forefront of our efforts, because the future of our planet depends on the actions that we take today. So thank you for being here. Let's ensure that this summit is a turning point in the fight against climate change. Welcome to Aspen Ideas Climate. So one brief housekeeping note before we get started. Please download and refer to your Aspen Ideas Climate app for any updated information on speakers and events. Are you ready to begin? Okay. So to kick it off, as someone who knows the collective power of stories, we're going to start with a powerful panel on storytelling to present this possible tomorrow that exists when we take care of our planet. So let's please welcome to the stage the executive producers of the upcoming PBS series, A Brief History of the Future, filmmaker and activist Kathryn Murdoch, and futurist Ari Wallach.
Hey,
come on, please take a seat. Thank you. All right, so before we begin, in order to frame the conversation and to get you excited to watch this series, we have a trailer for you. Here is A Brief History of the Future. Let's watch.
One moment, please.
How well we live tomorrow will depend on the action we take today.
when you hear the term the future, what does that conjure up? Human activity has damaged the systems of life that sustain us all.
We're seeing drought, wildfires, flood.
We could commit ourselves to extinction, or we could commit ourselves to a civilization in which human beings can continue to thrive.
Civilization is precious. Life is precious.
I set out in search of people who are building better futures.
Humans are extraordinary. We're such a miracle.
The land is resilient. We are resilient.
Fusion is really the holy grail of energy.
This is the largest 3D printed community in the world.
I have to know where I came from so that we can move forward.
What does it mean to be human at this moment in time? To care?
Boy, that really blows my digital mind. We've got to believe that there's a better way.
Where people have clean air, clean water, available food, cheap, abundant energy.
The big shared human projects, confronting climate change, staying a step ahead of the next pandemic, preventing nuclear conflict, will require cooperation.
That's the key for success. We are one team, the world.
Using human innovation and the brain that we can unlock, our problems will dissolve overnight. That's so important, Ari. Here. This.
People are building better futures for themselves and the communities around them.
This sustainable building is the cleanest power plant in the world. The roof is an alpine ski slope.
What we do and the things we create over the next few decades will shape all minds going forward for the rest of time.
Hundreds of years from now, we are going to look back on our generation as the most pivotal in human history.
All right, let's kick it off. Kathryn, the 6-part series is the first by your studios, Futurific, and it challenges this prevailing notion of a bleak and pessimistic future when it comes to the discussion about climate change. What alternative perspective does it present viewers?
I think the most important thing that we wanted to get across was that we needed to start asking the question, what if we got it right? What would that look like? Because we know, especially in this room, we really know all of the risks, we know all the things that can go wrong, and we are sort of steeped in all of those possibilities, but we don't spend enough time really thinking about what is a clean energy future like? What does it smell like? What does it sound like? How is it better? I mean, and so much of our time is spent on fear, and really, it's very important to have warnings about what could go wrong, but too much fear really triggers a feeling of not wanting to deal with it and pushing it away. And so what we want is to start to help people visualize what they're trying to get to. What's the ultimate goal of where we're going, and how do we plot a path there?
So it's almost like this conversation, and we talked about this, about the blue zones, right? And everybody gets really excited about that. How can we imprint that excitement about the future on the climate change discussion? Ari, to you, you are the host of the series. We saw you there on the trailer. What are some key moments that stuck with you, and why?
I mean, look, everyone in this room is going to be well-versed on a lot of the solutions that are happening right now in terms of climate change, but we also look at artificial intelligence, synthetic biology, housing issues, education, food. What stuck out to me more than any one specific kind of episode, segment, or element was the mindset shift that everyone I was talking to had gone through. So much to Kathryn's point, these were not folks who were focusing on like the doom and gloom. These were folks that were saying, in one way or another, I'm going to contribute not just towards a solution in the kind of classic climate change solution set, but towards solutions for better tomorrows writ large. So there.
You still have time to continue answering the question.
I thought I said the wrong thing. I played Taboo with my kids last week, and I had that same reaction.
Listen, that's the magic of a live show, right?
Was that the word I'm not allowed to say? Solution. So, look, we visited a place called Futurific, just outside of Amsterdam, which is known. It's a woman who runs a thing called a dementia village, and I won't go into the details of it. But in the U.S., if you have neurocognitive degenerative disease, you kind of go into a locked hospital ward. Whereas what they've done with Futurific is build an entire village so that folks can shop and go to restaurants and do a whole host of things. Now, what does that have to do with climate change? Directly, it's not directly obvious, but what it is it's emblematic of a mindset of saying, what are the ways that we normally would address something? We would be very highly reactive. This is a proactive, normative way of dealing with that issue. And so for me, the show, 72 different people I talk to around the world, you'll see that constantly, folks that are thinking and doing outside of the normal ways of how you may tackle any sort of kind of problematic situation.
And we get to see you in a snowmobile.
And it's to be on a snowmobile, which coincidentally at one point broke through the ice and we had a drone following me. So you see another quarter second of that, you almost lost me. So we only almost did 3 episodes. It was going to be a short docuseries.
Kathryn, when we talk about climate change, why is it important to include topics like AI and restoring coral reefs and making sure that this picture that you're painting is truly holistic when it comes to possible futures?
Well, we did set out to really focus on the future as a larger subject as opposed to just climate change. Climate change plays a part because it is going to be a part of our future. But these things are not siloed. They all interact. And one of the things that we really wanted to explore, so often when we talk about the future, we talk about technology. But we know that technology alone is not going to save us. In fact, we know, everyone in this room knows that we have the technologies to solve climate change, but we need the political and social systems functioning as well. And so some of the things we look into, like citizens' assemblies, for example, are a way forward in figuring out how to get people more involved and feeling like they have agency in government. We talked to President Macron about how they dealt with the Yellow Vest protests around energy pricing, and they used these citizens' assemblies to move forward. And it's also been used on topics like abortion and things like that. So very hot button, but they've come up with solutions and made people feel like they're part of the process and solving problems. And so that's the type of thing we want to look at. It's not just, yes, there's whiz-bang technology in there and it's fun. You've got mushroom leather and fusion and methane tracking satellites and things like that, but it's also what are the systems around all of those things that need to be functioning so that we can get to that better future.
I love that. So not just the focus on technological advances, but also developing functional social systems.
Yeah.
Ari, we just heard Kathryn name drop President Macron. We saw Pete Buttigieg in the trailer. What are some of these interviews that you got to conduct that people may know of in the series?
Look, one of the, when you're doing something like this, you always kind of go between like the very famous and the least famous. So I'll give 2 quick examples. One, I met with Kylian Mbappe, who is the French kind of global soccer football superstar. And with him, we talked about something very, very specific, which is the role of vision. And Kathryn talked about that in the beginning, which is, what I said to Kylian was very, very obvious. When you get up to take a penalty kick, do you envision yourself missing the kick or getting the kick in the back of the net? And he goes, of course I envision myself getting the ball into the back of the net. And where we go with that is the realization that as a society, we have not developed either necessarily the visioning power or to actually even have the real conversation about what does the ball in the back of the net look like for Homo sapiens over the next several decades. So we know what it is that we don't want. We more often than not do not articulate what we do want. And then finally, I met with a professor 2 hours north of Tokyo, and he does a thing called future design. So when he works with a community and organization about how they want to plan kind of long-term policy, he'll take about 1/3 of the audience or 1/3 of the participants, and he has them don these kind of ceremonial golden robes. And when you put on these golden robes, and it looks very cool, you immediately become a proxy for future generations, so those who cannot vote or be in the room. So you're no longer advocating for the present citizenry, you're advocating for the citizens of that town or that organization or that country 20, 30 years out. So those are kind of 2 examples of someone you know bringing a very interesting perspective to this conversation, someone you don't know who's completely rethinking how we plan for the long term.
That's fascinating. Kathryn, what are some of the challenges that you face as an environmental advocacy leader, given your family life?
I think one of the main reasons I did this project was actually because my daughter came to me a few years ago and said she didn't see any hope for the future. And I was really shocked because I've been working on climate change for like 17 years. And she knows all the solutions that we work on and we do democracy reform. She's very familiar with all of those things. But she said to me, but look at the films, look at the television shows, look at the books, especially the YA books. Everything is dystopian. And I sort of went around trying to prove her wrong, and I couldn't. Everything that we have visualized about our future is dystopian. Now, there's some of it's ecological, but you know, there's all kinds of choices. There's 27 flavors of dystopia, but there's no version where we actually get things right. And so that's when I started talking to Ari, and we started coming up with this idea, because I think, you know, we know there's a mental health crisis with our youth. We know they're feeling that they don't have any future, that they shouldn't have kids, et cetera. This is not the right way to go about this. Actually, you know, having children should make you more determined to be a better ancestor for those future generations. And that's the motivation that we had when we were making the show.
Looking at the sense of wonderment and possibility in the younger generations. That is a perfect segue for my last question to you, Ari, which is, you know, the series asks a fascinating question. How can we be the great ancestors that our future selves need us to be? So what is the message for the audience in terms of empowering them to take action toward that positive change?
So look, there's two main takeaways that we want people to have from viewing this show coming out April 3rd, 6-part docuseries, every Wednesday at 9 p.m. For those who actually have linear TV. If you don't, it's on the app and pbs.org and YouTube. It'll be hard to miss this show. Look, we've touched on this, we're gonna touch on it again. It's to actually ask yourself, in any meeting that you're in, be it today or when you go back to work, what does this look like if we get it right? Yes, I don't want to be Pollyannish about it and say we're up against zero obstacles and it's all rainbows and unicorns. But the fact of the matter is, more often than not, and I've been in rooms with you all, like we step back and say, these are all the things that are blocking us. This is how bad it's going to get. But if you can actually step back and actually have a vision of what it is that you are heading towards, you are much more likely to get to it and essentially be able to kind of rally people to it. So that's one. Two, it's that sense of agency coupled with awe. A lot of what we show in this show are really cool things. I'm in a nuclear fusion lab. I'm in Iceland and looking at these amazing geothermal, 100%. But the one thing you're going to take away from all the conversations and traveling that I do is everyone there is 100% focused on better futures and being a great ancestor, but they recognize that all started by having a conversation of what does it look like when we get this right? What does it look like if we're successful? And then, I've been a futurist for 20 years. One of the classic things we do is called backcasting. You start at the end and you work backwards to figure out what are the things that you have to do to get there. And so the takeaway from this show, the takeaway for those in the room, the takeaway for those watching, is to have that very strong vision. Know that you're not going to get there overnight. It's not about utopia or dystopia. It's what we call protopia, which is this idea of better tomorrow. It's not perfect, but better. But they start by having that conversation, first with yourself. What is it that I actually want to do? Why did I get started in this in the first place? And then how do I rally others around that vision, or actually plurality of visions of better tomorrows? That's what the show's about, and I hope people watch it and take back, be it at their dinner table or their boardroom table or wherever you are, the desire to have those conversations with those around you to think about what it is that you want to head towards together.
So a reminder for folks, April 3rd, 9 p.m. on PBS. If you can't catch it on linear TV, watch it on
PBS app, YouTube. You Google A Brief History of the Future, we will find you.
So watch, share, and amplify. Big round of applause for Ari and Kathryn. Thank you, guys. I'm going to ask you to exit stage left. By the way, you can amplify and share the conversations and takeaways that you're hearing on this stage by using our hashtag #AspenIdeasClimate. And now it is my great privilege to introduce our next speaker, Mireille Endara, an environmental advocacy leader from Panama, where she also served as Minister of the Environment. Now, Panama is very near and dear to my heart because of my extensive reporting there. I've gotten to know its remarkable people and its immense natural resources, and Mireille is the powerhouse behind its Conservancy. She now leads an innovative nonprofit effort with Marea Verde, focusing on sustainable leadership development as well as addressing global public pollution through local action, for which she won the 2023 McNulty Prize. Please welcome to the stage with this video, Cali Fellow at the Aspen Institute and a woman I am honored to call a friend, Mireille Endara.
It has been scientifically proven that they have found plastic in our blood, in our lungs, even in our breast milk. What do we do about that? Around the world, we produce approximately 400 million tons of new plastic in a year. but that will increase to 1.2 billion. That garbage ends up in rivers, and if it's in our rivers, it goes to our oceans. And so we started thinking about interventions in rivers, as well as piloting initiatives to improve our community. That's how Maria Verde started. Panama's story is like many of the 152 developing countries in this world. We're not an oil country. We don't have plastic industry, but we have a very big plastic pollution problem. We import all of our plastic. We export an insignificant amount to be recycled. So all the plastic that remains in Panama goes to landfill, gets burned, or it's sent to the oceans. Plastic pollution is a daunting, complex global problem. There are many ideas out there on how we can solve it. Hopefully many ideas in here too. By the end of this year, we may even have a plastic treaty that has to include curbs on plastic production if we really want to solve this problem. In my experience as former Minister of the Environment and leading nonprofits, I have learned that there's no one action that can solve a complex problem, but rather a myriad of interconnected actions. But what I find in reality, at least in Panama, is that there's a big disconnect from the global to the national to the local level. What gets agreed on international treaties does not translate immediately into effective national policies or solutions for communities. And this disconnect works against progress. And there's no time to waste. 2050, the year by when we will have more plastics than fish in the ocean, is around the corner. So keeping that disconnect in mind, our strategy focuses on rivers and the communities that surround them. Why rivers? Because rivers carry the trash that become 80% of marine debris. So rivers are the most effective place where we can close the tap on marine plastics. Now you saw in the video we have a device. Her name is Wanda. She is modeled after the Baltimore Bay trash wheels. Wanda is charismatic, and she's also innovative in that she combines a number of technologies that are typically used for other purposes, but here come together and help retrieve the plastics from the river. In 2023, Wanda was able to collect up to 155 tons of trash from the Juan Diaz River. And that is roughly 80% of the trash that traveled down the river in that period of time. Now, before Wanda, we knew that rivers carried trash to the oceans, only because we could see it, but not because we had any information of where was this trash coming from, what volume was being discharged, or what was this trash made of. Having local, up-to-date information is an eye-opener and is key to making good decisions and good policies. That's why we measure everything that we can. We are measuring what we take out of the river, the volumes, what is the makeup of this trash, communities' perceptions, river health parameters. And all of these things demonstrate the scale of the crisis that we have. We have mapped where trash enters the river systems, what we call hotspots, using drones and satellite images. And this is valuable information for local governments because then they know where they need to focus their efforts on waste collection. We also use data for community buy-in, using simple exercises like weighing household generation of trash in a 24-hour period made participants more aware of their plastic consumption, and therefore more open to participate in our community programs. As a consequence, we were able to divert 116,000 pounds of materials from landfill to oceans. All of this because we were collecting data locally and making it accessible to communities and governments. That leads me into our last area of action, which is community engagement. Nobody likes to live in garbage. But how do we make people connect and engage? We do 4 things. We raise awareness and educate on the problem. We also give them access to alternatives, like these recycling programs. We establish or reconnect with their sense of community, their pride, by making their communities prettier, cleaner, restoring their green areas. And we also establish trust-based relationships, understanding and valuing their needs and values. So in a workshop last January, when we gave out our results for a 2023 program to over 100 community leaders, I was encouraged to listen to their testimonies and their eagerness to keep working with us. I was also proud to see their shift in their perception and their actions. They now felt empowered to be able to demand better services for their communities and for themselves. Our solution works. And we're now scaling our impact to include all 9 rivers in the capital city of Panama, where over half the population of the country lives. While the world figures out a way on how to move forward in tackling plastic pollution, we will be doing our part from the bottom up, bringing solutions to communities, creating capacities, and stopping waste from reaching the oceans. Thank you.
And now, Kathryn Flowers, Jalone White-Newsome, and Rachel Ramirez.
Hello. Can everyone hear me? Hello, hello, hello. Okay, is that good? Is that better? Okay. Sounds good. Hi everyone, welcome. Wow. I think I've been covering environmental justice and climate for a few years now to know that 15 minutes is not enough to talk about every aspect of the issue. But I'm going to go ahead and kick us off by stealing a line from the father of environmental justice himself, Dr. Bob Bullard. He once told me environmental justice is no longer a footnote, it's a headline. And that's really what we're here to talk about today with 2 environmental justice powerhouses, Dr. J and Kathryn. So I'm going to go ahead, as you introduce yourselves, maybe I want you to talk about what are some ways in which you see environmental injustice play out in the real world, in your backyards, that many people may tend to ignore or gloss over, and something that needs fixing.
Well, thanks so much, Rachel, and thanks for the opportunity to be here. And just want to make sure that we start off by acknowledging the original caretakers of this land, because we know we would not be here if we were taking care of the earth the way that we should have. So when I think about that question, it is definitely personal. And there are so many injustices that we see, whether it's the fact that our weather is crazy, folks, again, having more asthma or any asthma, but there's also some injustices that can be invisible. And when I think about our work at the White House, particularly the Council on Environmental Quality and our Office of Environmental Justice, the injustices that we're trying to make visible are actually really dealing with access and accountability. So when you think about access, it's about being able to connect with folks that can make a difference, that can create decisions that can make your life better. And that's what we're trying to do in this administration. President Biden and Vice President have been so forward-leaning in making sure that we're building relationships with folks that have never had a relationship with the White House before. I also think about the access to resources, and that is primarily what we're trying to do through the Justice 40 initiative, making sure that 40% of the overall benefits of these investments are reaching disadvantaged communities. The second thing is accountability. There's not a community that I go to where someone doesn't ask me, how are you holding yourselves accountable at the White House? And that's an important question. And so when I think about the fact that we put out the first ever environmental justice scorecard to actually track how our federal agencies are advancing environmental justice or opportunities for improvement, that's major. Additionally, the fact that we put out, again, a new environmental justice executive order, which is an awesome document. But the one piece that I will bring up related to accountability is the fact that our agencies have to create an EJ strategic plan. And so it's not just going to be words on paper, but it's going to be something that we have to go back to and track and review and hold folks accountable.
And then Kathryn?
Well, from my vantage point, for those that don't know me, I'm Kathryn Coleman-Flowers from Lowndes County, Alabama. So I take that with me wherever I go, and through that frame of reference, I look at what's happening in rural communities, and I look at what's happening in marginalized communities, and try to bring to the forefront their stories so people can actually see the injustice. Because I believe that these injustices have gone on for so long because people don't see them. And my issue that I've been involved with now for quite some time is a lack of access to sanitation. And people just assume, you know, with Flint, the issue was the water being poisoned. But I think Flint was a milestone where we could also talk about the access to sanitation. And even here in Florida, I understand that some of the issues we've been talking about with failing septic systems, they're happening everywhere. But not only are septic systems failing, big pipe systems are failing. And it's failing more in marginalized communities. First and foremost, they're the canaries in the coal mine because of climate change. And also our economic paradigms oftentimes encourage these kinds of injustices. For an example, a lot of places, a lot of cities will put money and invest it in bringing a factory to an area and running infrastructure there and bypassing those communities that didn't have it, never got it, and can't advocate for it. So what we try to do is use storytelling to help people to see the injustices, so it helps the policymakers make better policies to make sure that these injustices don't continue. And I have to also say one of my roles is as the co-vice chair of the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council, where we get a chance to talk about these type of injustices that are taking place across the country and try to find some solutions.
No, I love that. And Kathryn, I was hoping you can build on that a little bit more, because you mentioned Flint. We also saw the same thing happen in Jackson, I believe 2 years ago now. It's been 2 years. And there are several other cities that we're not talking about. I remember writing about Mobile, Alabama, and other cities, bigger cities like New York City and whatnot. But can you talk about just the current state of water infrastructure in America right now, and just kind of how this, as you mentioned, this historical legacy of injustice kind of plays a role in where investment is going, who's being impacted and whatnot. So if you could expand on that a little.
You know, I got a chance in November of last year to go to Jackson, Mississippi. And when I went there, I was fortunate enough to run into the mayor in the airport. And he said, Kathryn, when you look at Jackson, what divestment creates. And it was very interesting because I went and I saw what was going on in Jackson firsthand. Some residents of the community took me around, explained their own trials and tribulations with the water issues in Jackson, the lack of water pressure. Sometimes they're afraid to drink the water. They gave me one example of when Deion Sanders was the coach of Jackson State University and all the people came to the homecoming, the water pressure went down because of the number of people that were in town. Just imagine living in a town and there's a homecoming game or a conference like this and the water pressure goes down. But when the next day I left and I went to Dubai. And when I went to Dubai and I looked at the history of Dubai, and Dubai is what could have been the black belt of the Middle East 60 years ago. But with divestment in Dubai, you're seeing a place that doesn't have a lot of water, but with divestment and innovation, they have become a destination. And the opposite with Jackson, and that is what the injustice looks like in this country, where it plays out over and over and over again, where people are not, where governments, and a lot of these problems are not on the federal level now. A lot of it is on the state and the local level, where they are ignoring communities that are poor, they're ignoring immigrant communities, they're ignoring rural communities, anyone they think do not have a voice. And the people that can afford to pay for the infrastructure get the government support, and the people that can't afford it don't get it. Those are the paradigms that we're trying to shift and change.
Now, speaking of water infrastructure, Detroit is also one of the major cities dealing with aging water infrastructure among many environmental justice issues. It's also one of the cities that are hit hard by the climate crisis. Now, Dr. J, you're from Detroit, and you've had your own personal experience of flooding there too. So how does it feel like to face this where you grew up? And you know, from a policymaker's standpoint now, how do you see these issues being addressed?
Yeah, so first of all, I want to appreciate Ms. Kathryn for all of her advocacy and brilliance and serving on our White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council. So let's, thank you. You know, I will say water is something that's really important. I grew up in the Great Lakes, and we had access to fresh water, and I just kind of took it for granted. But then you see the flip side, where in Detroit, you have folks that can't afford water. In Flint, you had the crisis of many crises across this country. And then you have the crisis that's brought on by extreme flooding. And so my parents, who live on the east side of Detroit, unfortunately experienced 5 floods in 2 years. And these were floods that you had water rising in their basement, where you lost family Bibles. And every time it rains, they still get scared because of that trauma, because of basically infrastructure that is just not up to date, and the lack of accountability by, in many ways, city and county governments. So when I think about the opportunity that this administration has to rectify that problem, not only for my parents, but for folks across this country, I am excited and hopeful. When I think about the monies through the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act that folks talked about yesterday, there's $55 billion that we are putting out there to make sure that clean water is delivered to communities across this country. $799 million just here in the state of Florida. So I have hope, again, that this administration has elevated environmental justice to a level that it's never been. They are actually seeing people and hearing people, and we're going to make progress. So that is what keeps me excited and hopeful, particularly on the waterfront. So folks like my parents won't have to deal with this repeated trauma ever again.
Well, thank you both. I'm looking at the time, and there's so much to talk about. That's why I was like, 15 minutes is not enough. So I'm going to combine both these questions since it's sort of related. But you know, across the country, we have seen environmental and civil rights protections being rolled back and challenged. You know, we've heard that some court rulings have been disheartening for some advocates. Kathryn, what have you been hearing on the ground? What are your thoughts on this? And for you, Dr. Jalone, I understand that you can't speak to any pending litigation, so I won't ask you to do that. So instead, just recognizing the currently polarized landscape, I'd like to ask about some of the efforts, solution-wise, that the federal government is continuing to pursue to advance environmental protection and environmental justice today.
Well, I'll start by saying that the U.S. Department of Justice took as its first case using Title VI to deal with the environmental justice, a complaint that we filed with Earth Justice against the Alabama Department of the Alabama Department of Public Health. When we did our parasite study and found evidence of hookworm in people in Lowndes County, Alabama, using PCR technology, they put on their website that it was not a valid study because we used PCR technology. And we filed that complaint, and that complaint was investigated by HHS and DOJ. And that was the first time that had ever happened in history where Title VI was used in this country to deal with environmental justice. And the first settlement was announced a year ago. We've also, using other methods that are in place now, the US EPA has an Office of External Civil Rights and Environmental Justice, and we've since filed another complaint against the state agency that will probably set up a potential challenge to determine whether or not Title VI can continue to be used for environmental justice. So we're just using all of the avenues that are available, whether it's through policy, whether it's through local advocacy, or whether it's, you know, working with the administration to make sure that environmental justice is at the forefront. At least we set some precedents where it will not be business as usual in these communities.
Yeah, I mean, so I don't want to shortchange the fact that this administration created the first Office of Environmental Justice ever. So that is something that we cannot take for granted.
Absolutely.
So for me, when I think about our goals as an office, one is to make sure that we're reducing burdens and harm on communities of color and low-income communities. The second is to make sure that we're delivering those resources to those same communities. And the third, and probably maybe one of the most important things, is to make sure that environmental justice is institutionalized across the White House and all of our federal agency partners. Because when you talk about environmental justice, this is a moment, but I don't want it to just be a moment. I think about when I'm gone. I think about when, again, if the political winds were to shift, how I want to make sure that we're doing everything in our power to make sure environmental justice is embedded in the fabric and foundation of the White House and the federal government. So there's a lot of things that our federal agency partners are doing to make sure that it sticks, that you might not see on the outside. But when you talk about changing your practice, changing your policies, changing your incentive structures, all these pieces that are going to make sure environmental justice is not just a word or the flavor of the week. And so that's what we are focused on right now. So all of the pieces of President Biden's ambitious environmental justice agenda, all of our initiatives and great things that we're doing, that's awesome. And we're trying to make sure that what we're doing now is going to make it durable, it's going to be sustainable, and that people, again, will be able to see the differences not just now, but years and decades from now. Because I remind myself and I remind my staff, what we're doing here is not about us. It's about the folks that we know and the folks that we don't know. And so I am truly, again, just blessed and privileged to be a part of this administration that gets it. And I hope people will realize that and see the difference that we're trying to make.
And that is a good note to end on. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Kathryn, Dr. Day.
Thank you.
Greg Gershuni, Jonathan Gillibrand, and Carrie Holland.
Hi, everyone. I'm Greg Gershuni, the director of the Aspen Institute's Energy and Environment Program and the director of Aspen Ideas Climate. We're so glad that you're all here to engage with each other on climate solutions to solve the climate crisis. Today, we're very proud of the partnership that we launched late last year with the State Department, the International Union of Conservation of Nature, Ocean Foundation, and Serious Business to end plastic pollution. Today, I'd like you to meet the State Department diplomats who are negotiating the international treaty to end plastic pollution, Jonathan Gillibrand and Carrie Holland, who will tell you a little about EPIC public-private partnership.
Great. Thanks, Greg. Thank you so much, and thanks to Aspen. We are the diplomats bringing the world together in a United Nations treaty with one clear goal, and it's this beautiful imagery behind you of a clean ocean and land ecosystems that are plastic-free.
When we bring all countries together, it still won't be enough to address the enormity of the plastic pollution challenge we face today. So we've launched a public-private partnership to convene NGOs, businesses, and communities around the globe to develop and share innovations and commitments. We will also launch solution-focused projects in countries around the world, starting in Africa and Central America this year.
So this partnership is called EPIC, the End Plastic Pollution International Collaborative, and has an initial $15 million of bipartisan supported funding. Importantly, EPIC also has the ability to take additional private financial contributions.
EPIC will focus on efforts to help stop the problem before it starts. It will drive innovation in materials, product design, and systems change ideas like reuse and refill.
And as part of that effort, and to incentivize engagement of the world's brightest minds, we would today like to announce the launch of an innovation prize competition with seed funding from the EPIC partnership.
The prize competition will be developed and launched by the Aspen Institute and look for transformational ideas to address plastic pollution and build a circular economy for plastics. Finalists will be recognized over the next few years, including at a future EPIC Ideas Plastic in the same format as this Aspen Ideas Climate Convening.
So to sum up, we are negotiating a treaty that will launch a global human endeavor to end plastic pollution. And with bipartisan domestic support, we're launching an accelerator that is totally EPIC, with an innovation prize, convenings, and international projects. And most powerfully, it is something that you all can get involved in and support.
So if there's one thing we want you to remember today, it is.
Oh, diplomats are much cooler than you thought, and you want to come and work at State Department.
Absolutely, please contact us about that. But also contact us about the Innovation Prize and EPIC through our EPIC host organizations. You'll see a QR code on the screen, and our partners, Aspen, IUCN, the Ocean Foundation, and Serious Business.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Greg.
And now, Michael Polsky and Justin Warland.
Hello, good morning. My name is Justin Warland. I write about climate and energy at Time. I'm really glad to be here with Michael Polsky, who is the founder and CEO of Invenergy, which is the largest private developer of renewable energy in the US. I want to start just by asking you about a Wall Street Journal headline for a profile about you. It calls you a renewable energy pioneer, not an environmentalist. I'm paraphrasing. You know, we were talking just in the green room about common sense and the need for common sense. What did you mean by that? And you know, what does that mean when they say not an environmentalist?
You know, I'm an engineer by training, and actually Invenergy, my third company, I started the first one in 80s, and then second one in 90s, and now, and I went through different technologies. I mean, when I started my first company, I did coal and then some oil, natural gas. My second company was involved in natural gas plants. I sold it as well. And then I started Invenergy in 2001, again looking at gas, and then sort of start looking at wind, and to me it made sense. So what I like to tell people that, you know, technology is changing, just like everything else in life, right? I mean, we used to have no cell phones, then smartphones, then this, and nobody argues about this, but somehow in energy, everything is politicized. So we sort of stuck to the old stuff because politically it's sort of advantageous for some people. So what I like to say that as we see world is changing, and we get new things and new technologies and new abilities to do things different ways, then we have to embrace it. We shouldn't fight this. So to me, I got into renewables because I looked at advantages. For example, in case of wind first, You can build it at a fixed cost. You don't have fuel. It's much simpler in some ways. You don't pollute. You don't need water. I mean, to me, it helps national security. To me, all those things just make sense. It's not political. It's not, I didn't get in the win because I want to save the world necessarily. I got in the win because it made sense. Then they got solar and storage and transmission line and so on. So unfortunately, energy, and particularly the renewable energy, and particularly anything that touches climate, got so politicized that it doesn't make sense.
So you want to strip out the politicization. That makes sense. I want to shift gears a little bit. We're at this interesting moment where we have a lot of headwinds and tailwinds in the energy transition. Tailwinds, with the IRA here in the US, headwinds, all these issues around supply chains and permitting and all these things. You have a very broad view of all of this. Where do you see us in this bigger picture, in this journey? And what are some of the bigger, most concerning challenges that you're facing?
Yeah, I've obviously, listen, there are always challenges, and supply chain, like you mentioned, sorry, is a big challenge. But I think the biggest challenge is political challenge, because we're sort of not sure where we belong. I mean, obviously, you read newspaper and, our policy may change dramatically based on next election. So in a way, it's sort of very fragile environment. And, obviously, you go on costs, it's one way to do business. You go in the middle of the country, people look at things differently. So that's a challenge. But those are political challenges. But as far as we also have other challenges, such as, for example, our electrical grid and transmission. Now, it's my big thing is talk about transmission, because people don't realize how fragile this grid is, and that would hold us back to implement IRA, for example, at the full scale, is inability to connect, inability to transfer power. It affects reliability, particularly with renewables. Renewables are very climate, if you will, weather-related technologies, so therefore we have to connect bigger geographies, which we're not doing. And those all things add up together, and listen, there's always a challenge. I think we're doing good things, but still there are a lot of sort of obstacles on the way.
So I think it's maybe important to stop and underline this grid point, because I think for a lot of people, as we're going through talking about climate, it's easy to talk about renewables without thinking about this bigger context of the state of the grid. And so I wonder if you could just underscore that. I mean, how serious are the challenges with the grid? How are they perhaps hindering you continuing to deploy renewables? And then, importantly, what are the fixes? And so that's a lot to throw in there, 3 questions, but what do you think?
Grid is much bigger issue than most people realize. That, we have a grid. Grid means our transmission system is built for all days. It's like, it's like we have smartphones without internet. I mean, what's the purpose here? So when we add more generation, more renewables, and by the way, people talking nuclear SMRs, they will face the same problem, that we need to connect these sources to the grid that located in a different positions than we used to have generation is located. Plus we have increased electrical demand. So renewables, for example, a lot of renewables in the area where there is no load, so you have to connect it to the load center. Also, as I mentioned before, renewables are weather-related resources. It means that if we don't have sun and you have renewables in a small geographical area, they're all related. All the solar plants go up and down at the same time. So we should connect larger geographies so we have different weather patterns and we can back up certain areas to another. And simply just to connect this called dispersed resources to the grid, you have to have grid coming to the different areas. So we have that, and another thing is reliability. Like when we have more renewables, it's not economical to back up one-to-one, so you want to minimize backup because it costs money, and it's also mainly backups come from fossil fuels. You have to have a grid that connect much larger geography, which we want to do. So the hindrance is that we used to have utilities that have their own small service territory. Then we went to this called RTOs, Regional Transmission Organization, that's supposed to create bigger geography. But now the RTOs themselves try to protect their turf, and they don't want to interconnect larger geographies. So the RTOs become sort of utilities of today, where they kind of try to do all this transmission project with their footprint that really maybe helps a little bit, but it doesn't solve the problem because they don't connect, larger geographies. And that's a problem. And then what my fear is, then we have a major issue with the grid, and then what would happen? We'll start finding a scapegoat. Who is the scapegoat of the renewables? And therefore, people start backlashing, oh, you know, because of renewables, we have all this problem, which is not really true.
Right, I think you make a lot of critical points, and I want to underscore this last point about renewables, because as you said, sometimes, you know, it is both true that they're intermittent, and you know that poses challenges, but there's also solutions to those challenges, and you alluded to that with, you know, talking about transmission and also storage, which is changing, but transmission being a critical solution right now. And I wonder if you could talk about the things that could happen, perhaps that might be accessible, you know, ways that people might be able to engage in some of this conversation regarding transmission. What are the things that could happen that would help improve the state of transmission in the US?
You know, I think we need federal government leadership, because transmission, the way grid is now looked at, it's very regionally and even state by state. So in each state, there is a issue cost. You probably heard this terminology, cost allocation. Who pays for what? And when we have 50 different states, and reliability, it's hard sometimes just think on a state-specific basis. It's going to be national basis. So I think we have to go through this, out of this feudal regional concept or small area concept, where what is there for me, and to look at more national scale. My view is just like a highway system. We have National Highway Administration that, you know, looks at the highway. Each state doesn't say what is there for me, but we look nationally, and perhaps we need sort of National Transmission Administration or agency that look for the interests of the entire country. Because like I mentioned, you know, look at the pipeline system. Natural gas, you look at the map, it crisscrosses all the states, and it's a national kind of issue here. But transmission, how become so isolated. I mean, if we build transmission, each state there, what is there for me? I don't want to pay for this. Somebody else has to pay for it. And it's very, very difficult to do it. And also we have, like I said, these RTOs that only look in with their footprints, which is absolutely wrong. You know, we have to look on a broader scale, because world has changed. It's not the same. And I think it's very important that people in this audience and everywhere understand this is a big issue. We gotta talk about this. And it's not a technical issue that so narrow that only sort of insiders have to deal with this. This is a big issue, because otherwise, you know, we won't be able to supply the power to where we need to go.
So you've been talking about RTOs. I hesitate to bring in another acronym, but FERC is an important player in this, and there are 3 FERC nominees, and perhaps this is, you know, nominees that need to be confirmed. This is something that you know, people can engage in with their own elected officials. I'm curious, though, you know, what do you see as the situation with FERC, and is there a potential to help break this logjam with these nominees for the commissioners? And maybe we should also explain what FERC is. So maybe start with that.
FERC is an acronym for Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. It's basically a federal agency that's supposed to oversee our electricity market, to make sure that everything we do is called just and reasonable, and look beyond states and look at on the national scale. So the entire grid is part of FERC jurisdiction except Texas, because Texas is separate, just because they're not interconnected with the rest of the country. They want to be separate. But so I'm not going to touch Texas here. But FERC's supposed to deal with these transmission issues. And I think they should, they must. It's not an option. And I think that FERC needs to be, in my opinion, more aggressive to really, I know those are important issues, but we cannot hide in the sand because they're so important that we cannot deal with them. I think FERC has to really step in because everybody is looking for FERC leadership, particularly in the transmission, and there is a lot of rhetoric there, and a lot of, you know, you open major publication, you always see transmission, 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 but I don't think that FERC does enough. And we're all looking for FERC leadership, you know, as I mentioned, particularly on interregional transmission. They call high voltage DC lines that connect large, because when you go very long, you cannot go AC, you have to go DC, you know. So we all looking for FERC leadership, and they have to step up.
And can these nominees help fix that, or what's your view?
I hope. I mean, listen, that's the objective, because if we don't have, without FERC, it's because we don't have any other avenue to deal with this unless there is some sort of a legislation. But I think that's the agency that we're all looking at.
Well, we don't have time for another question, but I want to say thank you. I think you did a great job outlining the challenges that the grid faces and some of the potential ways that we might address that. So thank you so much to Michael Polsky.
And now, Mayor Justin Bibb and Daniela Levine Cava. United States Deputy Secretary of Transportation, Polly Trottenberg, with Shannon Osaka.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining our panel here on urban transportation. I'm Shannon Osaka. I'm a climate reporter for the Washington Post, and I'm joined here by the lovely Mayor Daniela Levine Cava of Miami-Dade, Mayor Justin Bibb of Cleveland, and the chair of the Climate Mayors, and U.S. Deputy Secretary of Transportation, Polly Trottenberg. Yay. So I'd love to turn to Mayor Bibb first. You are the new chair of Climate Mayors, which is a network of over 300 mayors who are working for climate action. What are the key levers of change that you see mayors being able to pull, and how are you looking to activate those levers in 2024?
I often say that America's mayors are at the front lines of the many issues we're facing across our country, but we are also at the front lines of the solutions to these issues. And so this is the year of action for climate mayors, leveraging all the amazing federal investment that this president has given us to address climate change across the country. So we're engaging the private sector to leverage that investment. We want to make sure we're bringing our residents along as well too, because most folks in Cleveland have no idea what the Inflation Reduction Act is or what the bipartisan infrastructure bill is. But here's what they do know. They want clean water, fresh air, and safe streets. And that has to be how we talk about these critical core policy issues every single day.
And Mayor Levine Cava, Florida has the second highest number of EV registrations in the country, but it still takes a lot to move a very urbanized environment with multifamily housing to electric vehicles. How is Miami-Dade working on this and trying to boost EV adoption in the city?
We are EV friendly, we are EV ready. We've built in EV charging facilities to a lot of our county buildings and parking areas. And I also got legislation passed to require new dwellings to have the capacity for EV infrastructure. And we've electrified our fleet. Just yesterday, Administrator Regan from the EPA was down to celebrate 50 new electric school buses on top of the 50 that they had already committed. So 100 bus fleet, and we already are matching that. We have 70 in service, and it'll be 100 very shortly, and we're going up to 170. So we expect to be the largest electrified fleet, including on our South Dade corridor, where it will all be bus rapid transit, electric buses, the first in the nation. Yes.
I want to turn to the Deputy Secretary. This is a very busy time for DOT. You have the bipartisan infrastructure law, you have the IRA funds. What are you seeing as the challenges in the rollout of those funds? And I understand that you also may have an announcement that you want to make.
I do have an announcement. Thank you so much, Shannon. Great to be here with two, I have to say, of our country's most amazing mayors. Let me talk about the announcement and then get to your questions. So you are right, between the bipartisan infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act, DOT is having the opportunity to roll out an unprecedented set of programs and projects to address climate change. It is truly, as you say, one of the most exciting and busy times to be in transportation. Today we will be rolling out, we'll see if we can get the information up on screen. If not, you can go online. Our low carbon transportation materials program, $2 billion that will be apportioned to states, and there'll be a competitive program for cities and counties to look at innovative ways to decarbonize the transportation, construction, and manufacturing process. And I know, looking at this crowd, I'm sure we have some private sector innovators in the audience. This is a program I hope will really bring innovation, public-private partnerships, looking at new ways we can manufacture materials, reduce carbon usage throughout the whole transportation process, and train the workforce, too, to be a part of what we hope will be an amazing decarbonization of how we build and operate our transportation projects. It builds upon, just to sort of ask for the challenge, we're running a low-carbon program, a protect program for climate resiliency, roadway safety, things that I know these mayors and others around the country have been great partners in. So we're busy, but it's a good kind of busy, and we're grateful for the opportunity and the resources that have come through our president's legislation to tackle climate. As you say, cities are on the front lines. Transportation is too. Transportation is the biggest part of the carbon emissions in our country, but we will be a biggest part of the solution as well.
Thank you. We've talked a little bit about electric mobility, EVs, things like that, but as climate folks here, I think we all know that we also need to move away from a very car-centric culture. And I'm curious, I want to turn to the mayors first on this, but we've heard this concept of the 15-minute city, and it's gotten some interesting attention as well from some parts of media. But can you talk about sort of what this concept is and how mayors can help to move towards that more walkable, more pedestrianized version of the city? Maybe, yeah, Mayor Bibb, let's get you first.
I saw this firsthand during the pandemic when, in many parts of our city, our residents didn't have a grocery store they could go to within 15 minutes that sold fresh fruits and vegetables. Many folks didn't have access to good quality transit within 15 minutes. So this is really about, in my opinion, ensuring we have high quality amenities in every part of our city. That's why we want to become, in Cleveland, one of the first 15-minute cities in North America, because we truly have to prioritize people over cars. Too many of our residents are dying on our streets, And so we are working aggressively to have more protected bike lanes. We also need to make sure that as we think about safety, speed tables, those things go a long way to give our residents confidence that our streets are safe for families and children. And by doing this, this shows us that we're focused on equity and also focused on justice as well too, but it also helps us to be more economically competitive long-term as a city as well.
Have you had any backlash against this idea of the 15-minute city? Because I know that that has happened in some places.
A lot of backlash from a lot of misinformation in our media. I'll give you one example. One of our leads in our city planning department became the ire of the extreme right because we were introducing legislation to eliminate parking minimums in our streets. And it's a shame that we have this toxic media environment that doesn't allow us to have basic, common sense, pragmatic conversations about what makes our cities great. And so we as mayors have to do a better job of combating this misinformation in our media and really tell our residents exactly what these plans and policies are all about.
Mayor Daniela, how do you think about this? How do you think about sort of reorienting streets away from cars, more towards smart transit?
We're very land constrained. We have the ocean, we have the Everglades, and kind of a narrow strip. I heard it described recently as between the sharks and the alligators. So we know that we cannot just continue to build in the old suburban patterns, and we don't have infrastructure, more traffic as a result, et cetera. So we have intensely densified our transportation corridors and also created other incentives for more densely building. So we created something called the Rapid Transit Zone along our corridors, which we identified aggressively to build out our public transit. The only solution for traffic, we do have it, ladies and gentlemen, here, is transit. We cannot build roads to solve that problem. So it's a, yep, that was an applause line I heard. It works together. We have to build taller instead of out into our farm and endangered lands and protecting our water supply, our Everglades, and so on. And we've done it through this zone that allows for greater densification, fewer parking requirements, and a good bit of subsidy as well, and requirements for mixed income, so that we do have a range of income mixes in these transit corridors, very popular. We're even hoping for a major federal grant for our North Corridor, which isn't yet developed along that corridor, but we've shown that once we make the plans, that the people and the development will come on our South Corridor. So this is a little out of the past pattern of kind of get in line for your major transit projects, and you have to prove density. Well, we know that density is coming, and we've proven it, and so we're so grateful that this administration has found other ways of prioritizing some of these projects. And she already knows. But truthfully, as far as pushback, really not so much, especially with the fact that we have so many newcomers. We have people coming from urban areas where they're used to world-class transit, or young people who prefer not to have cars, and even some of us older folks that are ready to give up our yards and move into that 15-minute focal area. I'm not quite there yet, but I'll get there. So I think we have really all the right ingredients to incentivize and motivate to build differently. But there are some headwinds because there is a demand. There's a huge demand for housing, and the costs are very high. And so it's sometimes cheaper to build on that open land, and so we have to educate people about the cost of that.
Absolutely. And Deputy Secretary, how is the Department of Transportation working, as Mayor Daniela mentioned, to try to help incentivize that moving forward?
Right, I mean, we are very focused, again, in addition to all the programs to decarbonize the transportation sector, to look at ways, obviously, that we can help with mode shifting, get more people out of cars, onto mass transit. We are making record-breaking investments in transit, in passenger rail, and in projects that prioritize roadway safety, active transportation. So part of how we're doing that is really tapping into the creativity and the local voices. We have extraordinary grant dollars at our fingertips, and the best ideas are coming from all over the countries, from cities large and small, from tribal areas, and part of what we're doing is helping to partner with those communities to get some of those ideas on the ground. Something I had a lot of experience with in New York, particularly with our Safe Streets and Roads for All, doing quick pilot projects, tactical urbanism, getting some of that paint on the ground so that your citizens can start to see the possibilities of these projects, of a new bus lane, of a new bike lane. And that helps build the support that sometimes I think we've all had in our opportunities in urban government. You need to show people, sometimes you need to show people, and seeing is believing, and we're getting to be a real partner in that. We're also, with our sister agencies, with HUD and Department of Energy and EPA, trying to think together holistically about the land use issues, transportation efficiency, those bigger picture issues which are multidisciplinary, but which are really the ways we're going to help transform cities and make them, in some cases, more of that 15-minute city.
Absolutely. So we have all of this new funding that's flowing all throughout the country trying to remake our transportation system. I mean, what do mayors need from the Biden administration and vice versa in order to really make these collaborations work? Mayor Bibb.
Well, I have to say, I've only been mayor for over 2 years now, but in my lifetime, I've never seen an administration who cares about cities like this administration does. And as the president said in his State of the Union address, you know, America's comeback is going to be fueled by America's cities and towns. And as I look at Cleveland's future, making sure we continue to leverage these federal investments in a very equitable way is a key part of my vision and focus as mayor. I'll give you an example. You know, as we're thinking about the new EV boom in our country and how that federal investment is going to change the ecosystem of electric vehicles across the country, it's so important that particularly in majority black cities like Cleveland, that those residents feel like they can be a part of that movement. And so we prioritize, as we are launching new EV stations across our city, we're prioritizing building them in black and brown neighborhoods to help connect the dots. And so as we launch these new EV charging stations and go door to door to talk about the EV tax credits, it gives them confidence that they are a part of this movement, and we couldn't have got it done without this administration working with America's mayors.
Well, it's been great. Okay. We are ready to receive all of those investments, and we're very grateful for what we have received. In fact, we do a quarterly report, and we're up to almost $1.4 billion in discretionary federal grants through these programs across the board, and many of them focused on transportation, including at the airport and the seaport. So we have, for example, gotten funds for Vision Zero to reduce pedestrian and bicycle injuries. Unfortunately, that is a big challenge, and I'm glad you mentioned that, because if we want people to be in 15-minute cities, we have to keep them safe. We also have been hugely supported for our solar projects, the EV that we've mentioned, and we're looking also at the elective pay option, which is really a rebate. It's like a tax rebate for those that don't pay taxes, if you get it. But it's really going to be huge for us in helping us to expand our solar and other energy reduction. We also have the Priority Climate Action Plan that we've developed thanks to the EPA Climate Pollution Reduction Grant. We got a planning grant, and now we're going for the big dollars. And we're also designated as a climate tech hub by U.S. Commerce, and put in the full proposal to draw down multi-millions to help us to develop the industry around climate advances. So it's been a beautiful partnership, a beautiful relationship. We're like I say, I'm like this, ready at the shoot.
Hands out. Deputy
All right,
Secretary.
well, I thank you, mayors, and I will say I am really proud to be part of the Biden-Harris administration, which you are right. really cares about cities and sees them on the front line of delivering our agenda of infrastructure investment, of job creation, of equity, of addressing climate change. And look, at DOT, we like to brag. I was transportation commissioner in the biggest city in the country for 7 years and on the front lines for a lot of the types of things you're trying to do. And obviously our secretary, former mayor himself, I would say of a small city, he would say of a mid-sized city in Indiana. But I think both of us bring our experiences actually of being in small and large cities and how you do navigate working with the federal government. And you know, small communities feel like it's challenging. It's challenging for big cities too. But that focus has gone into particularly, traditionally transportation funds tend to go to states, but we now have a number of programs, and these two cities and so many others around the country have been successful in competing for those dollars, again, for roadway safety, for climate projects, for EV charging, and you are absolutely right, Mayor Bibb, for the EV charging dollars that we have given out to local communities. We've put an enormous focus on equity communities, and 70% of those dollars have gone to disadvantaged communities. So, you know, we have programs specifically targeted to cities, and you know, what would we like from cities? We have declared year 4 of the Biden-Harris administration to be the year of project delivery. So obviously, we want to see amazing work on the ground in cities all over the country, and we stand ready to be partners, of course, to help make it happen.
Wonderful. Well, I promised folks backstage that I would absolutely keep this to 20 minutes, so let's have a round of applause for our panelists.
And now, James Abraham.
Good morning. My name is James Abraham. I'm the founder of Minzo. Let me start with an apology. I'm an engineer. That's a confession. I will need to bring that back up later, so I thought it would be very good to be upfront. Several years ago, I was asked a very interesting question, or a surprising question. I was asked, how do we get individuals, masses of people, engaged intimately in this journey of solving the climate crisis? Now, I have to tell you, my co-founder, Tanya, and I had spent more than a decade building solar power plants, displacing coal in our country, involved in climate negotiations, helping companies with their journey on climate. So we thought we were already engaged. But this phrase, more intimately engaged in our lives, really caught us. And when we looked at ourselves, we realized, actually, we were not that intimately engaged. So we asked ourselves why. And we fell onto the language that we use when we describe climate. It's very big language. Global temperatures, weather patterns, energy transition, phase down. Apparently, I'm allowed to say phase down and not phase out, but we'll talk about that later. Phase down of fossil fuels. This is a language that keeps the individual out of it. It's very difficult to find ourselves in there when there's billions of dollars at stake and time frames are lifetimes away. And as an individual, when you look at this, we're left with sometimes fear, sometimes helplessness, and maybe a little bit of activism. So we said if we had to solve this, we had to find a way to make actions atomic so we could act. We had to find a way to make time frames near so we could visualize it. And we had to make the funds required within our grasp so we could afford it. So here's where the apology comes in. As I said, I'm an engineer. My answer to these questions does not move towards art or film or policy or regulation. We tend to build things. So we built a personal emissions tracker. and I did this on my own life. I measured everything I did and converted it into emissions. If you want to do something depressing in your life, do this. So you see that really nice green tree? Some days are like that. It's a good day, low emissions. But most of my days, my emissions were so high, the landscape was barren and the tree was desiccated. When I looked at my own climate identity, my own climate story, I was the villain in this story. And I wanted to change this. So I dug deep into the data, and I found there were some things I could do. And it was interesting. But the real magic is what's happening here now. Some of you are curious. You're asking, is that possible? Is that something I could do? Wow, if we could only get this together. Same thing happened in my team. We all started asking ourselves what this means. We broke this up. We created a score to allow us to compare ourselves to each other. We broke up our emissions, personal versus professional, the stuff that had to do with work. We looked at our trend lines. We became a community in conversation with real personal data. And when we became a community in conversation with real personal data, we became a community in action. Many of you have step trackers and calorie counters. You all share these step trackers and calorie counters. You become communities in action when you've got data about yourself and you're sharing it with each other. As we became communities in action, we found ways to change our own emissions story. We found that there were some emissions that were, like that really amazing dessert that you just cannot give up that spikes your blood sugar. It spiked our emissions. And there were other types of emissions that are just habits, and I'm not going to give you an analogy of bad habits. We all have them. So those habits were things that we needed to change over time. As we dug deep into this, especially our professional emissions, we changed the way we commuted. We looked at work from home versus work from office. We became much more sensitive and aware of the options around us as our cities were introducing new forms of public transit, electric buses and such. We got engaged with that. Of course, we still continue composting and recycling, which, by the way, great things to do. Please keep doing them. But we were able to go much further on those avenues. We started to become more sensitive about waste, water, plastic. Perhaps most importantly, especially for the politicians that were up here, we became aware of our options at the voting booth, and that became a part of our conversation. So we finally found ways to get more engaged in this, and we started to reduce our emissions, and it was exciting for a while. 6 months into this, I found I started to plateau out. I don't like plateauing. I needed to get to the next stage, so I adopted another great phrase that we have in climate, net zero. Remember net zero? Very big word, but I said, I want to make this personal. How do we get to personal net zero? So I took the emissions and I said, I want to get to net zero by 2030, not some faraway goal, but something more within, personally, my lifetime. And I said, what would happen to my emissions if I did nothing? Can I project it? Ari and Kathryn this morning said that our future is less dystopian than we think. I found that answer. I found that left to itself, my emissions would reduce by 30% just because of all the work you're doing. Our grid is getting more green. Our transportation is getting better. Airlines are thinking about using new forms of tech and fuel. It's all changing around us. That our future looks actually brighter, and I could see it in my numbers. But it wasn't enough, because I wanted to get to zero. 30% isn't zero. So I decided I needed to find a way to take out the rest of my emissions. So we created this swipe to net zero. Swipe right, not left. Swipe right to net zero. The way this works is it measured my residual emissions in 2030 and told me how big a forest I would need, forest, not trees, to be able to sink all of my carbon emissions going forward. If I had this much of a forest, my own, at this time, then I would be net zero from that day on. Now, when I say forest, you're all thinking companies, countries, big, millions, tens of millions of trees, hundreds of thousands of hectares. You're thinking saving the tropical savanna. We wanted to atomize this to each individual. So this is a portion of a large forest. We've planted a large forest in the eastern hills of India, and we've taken it out and atomized it so each person can have a part of it for themselves. And you can track it. And this is a forest that lives in a community. You can see the farmers and the livelihoods that are being changed. And we took this approach to say, let's do assets and not offsets, because just like we have cars and homes that are assets and parts of our lives that emit, we should have a part of life that actually absorbs and sinks our carbon. Get to know this group intimately well, and to build a connection with the population that keeps our carbon neutral, takes us to net zero. So that's Minzo. That's my journey to my net zero. You can actually try this out for yourself if you would like. It's available on both the App Store and the Google Play Store. And if you want to try out, experience this in short form, we have a 1-hour experience scheduled for you tomorrow. You can experience a 6-year journey, your own personal net zero journey, tomorrow at 11:30. But really, if you try it and start going, we'd encourage you to create these communities in conversation, communities in action. Because together, we are a really powerful force. We can move investments, we can change markets, we can shape policy, and as Ari and Kathryn said this morning, we can write the history of our own climate future. It starts when each of us can grasp the possibility in our own lives. Thank you.
Thank you so much to James Abraham. James was actually my moderator at my globalization seminar in India a year ago, and it's beautiful to reconnect on this stage. Thank you so much, James. Thank you for helping us write our own climate change story. Now, storytelling has been the theme of the morning, and our next panel is going to discuss how to tell America's climate change story. And for that, I am honored to introduce our next duo of powerhouse speakers. We have Kathryn Hayhoe, who is Nature Conservancy's chief scientist, and she is making sure that communities that don't often get included in the climate change conversation have a voice, and that is key to changing the narrative. She is going to be joined by the one and only 13-time Emmy Award-winning journalist who I worked at with NBC News and who helped me cover storms and hurricanes. When there was little sleep and little food, always did it with a huge smile, Mr. Al Roker. Thank you so much. Hi, Kathryn.
Thank you. Oh, and that was really underwhelming, so we really appreciate that. That was, and that really, oh, it's building.
It is.
It's building.
Yes.
Wow. Well, thank you for being here. And Kathryn, yeah, I've been a huge fan of yours, and I just admire so much what you do and the message you've been putting out. And you were an author of, you were one of the authors on the 5th National Climate Assessment, talking about current climate. And what I found fascinating is that literally no part of the country in this report is going to be untouched by climate change. And mitigation and resilience projects have to be instituted. What was last year, $28 billion disasters. Last 5 years, each year it's a new record. Talk about this report's findings and why it is so urgent right now. The report brings out the urgency and what we need to be doing now.
Yes. Well, speaking of urgency, if I could just alter what you said slightly, you said every aspect of the country, every part of the country will be affected. I would say is being affected. And what you do so powerfully is you bring that into people's homes on a daily basis, making it part of their lives. So we know, I've authored the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th National Climate Assessment under the Bush, Obama, Trump, and Biden administrations. And each time we are bringing out more and more information about how climate change is here, not just over there, and it's now, not just in the future. But what we're seeing now is that our adaptation and resilience efforts are much larger than they were. I remember in the 2nd and 3rd National Climate Assessment, we were beating the bushes across the country to try to find 2 examples to put in a box of adaptation and resilience. Mm-hmm. And now there's an entire figure showing that in every state around the country there are multiple adaptation and resilience initiatives, but we also know it's not enough because the changes we're seeing happening are happening faster than humans have ever experienced. We've never seen changes this fast, and our entire society is just not built to change that quickly.
Talk about, when you say adaptive resilience, what do you mean?
I mean preparing. And the analogy I use, I always think in images, is We've been living for hundreds and thousands of years as a society as if we're driving down the road into the future, looking in the rearview mirror. All of our planning, our building codes, where and how we grow our food, how we allocate our water, it's all built on the way things were in the past. And if the road is straight, I live in Texas where there's a lot of very straight roads. So if the road is straight, you can drive down the road looking in the rearview mirror. You just, you know, as long as there's not a wild boar on the road, which does happen in Texas.
Yikes.
Yes. But today, we're on a curve larger than any we've ever negotiated in the history of human civilization, and so we have to look ahead, and that's what adaptation and resilience is. It's looking at what the conditions will be like for my home, for this road that we're building, for the crops that we're growing, for the water we're allocating, not just today, but in 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, will my home be safe? Will the road be usable? Will there be enough food? Will there be enough water? And in some cases, the answer is, if we continue on our current pathway, no.
Yeah, and in some cases, it's already happening.
Yes.
In a lot of places. Climate change is referred to as a threat multiplier. You know, we've got these extreme weather events happening more and more recently. The effects of climate change, you know, while people may question climate change, which I don't understand how they do that, but they need to realize that everything that's happening now is being made worse by climate change.
That's a great way to put it. I love that idea of a threat multiplier because so often people think, well, okay, you scientists, you broadcast meteorologists, you environmentalists, you care about climate change, but I'm not any of those, so why should I care? But the reality is if our kid plays outdoor sports, or we have, you know, a young toddler who wants to play outside in the summer and it's going to be too hot for them to do that. Or our insurance rates just doubled in a single year, which happened to many people right here where we are today in Florida. We realize that this is already affecting their lives. If they can get it, exactly. So we have to show people that what they already care about, the places, the people, the things they already care about, whoever they are already being affected. And that to care about climate change, you have to only be one thing, and that one thing is not Al Roker, and it's not a climate scientist, although Al Roker and climate scientists obviously care very much. But it's just a human living on planet Earth.
Yep.
And if we can make that connection, that's how we help people see that they're the perfect person to help catalyze solutions wherever they are too.
And when you talk about problems in certainly communities of color are vastly more affected by climate change. The folks that can least afford it are the ones that are more greatly affected by it.
Yes, climate change affects us all, but it doesn't affect us all equally. And for me, I mean, that's very personal for me because that's why I became a climate scientist, when I realized how profoundly unfair it was that the people who had done the least to contribute to the problem in the first place were the ones bearing the brunt of the impacts. Now, back about 30 years ago, the biggest socioeconomic inequalities we had in the world were between countries, richer versus poorer countries. 2/3 of our socioeconomic inequality was between country. Today, 2/3 of our socioeconomic inequality is within country. So that means within our own cities. Let me just give you a couple of tangible examples. Take any large city in the US. The lower income neighborhoods during a heat wave could be anywhere from 7 up to 15 degrees Fahrenheit hotter during the same heat wave than wealthier neighborhoods. Because they're covered in concrete, they have no green space. Why not? Decades of racist redlining practices. No available mortgages. This is the only cheap place to live. And those places also are much more prone to flooding often, because it's cheaper to buy a place that is more likely to flood. Much worse air pollution because they never had the political or socioeconomic clout to stop a freeway from going right through the neighborhood.
Or factories being built next to them.
Or a waste dump right there. So then along comes climate change. Those areas are hotter, they're more prone to flooding, they're more polluted, and of course fossil fuel emissions produce so much particulate pollution that's responsible for millions of deaths every year. So climate change is not fair. And that's why when we look to solutions, we need to look to solutions that address health, equity, families, air quality, nature, oh, and climate change too.
If you take care of one, you'll take care of the others.
Yes.
You know, one of the things I was fascinated when I first found out about you is that you're a Christian, and you wear that proudly. But you said you were a little hesitant to come out as a climate scientist, as a Christian. And yet you say, if you really are, or a believer, in, if you're a faithful person, that climate change or protecting the climate is something that you, if you read the Bible, you probably should be part of.
Yes. I mean, I'm convinced that if you take the Bible seriously, and a lot of people claim they do, that you would be at the front of the line demanding climate action. Because at the very beginning of the Bible in Genesis, it says God gave humans responsibility over every living thing on this earth. And it makes it clear it's not living things in terms of non-human. That includes us, our sisters and brothers too. And then at the very end of the Bible, there's this verse that hardly anybody reads. It says, God will destroy those who destroy the earth. Yeah, it's in the book of Revelation. But for me personally, what's through the rest of it, what's bookended by those two statements, is continued emphasis on how the most seemingly insignificant aspects of nature matter, and how we are all as humans, regardless of our faith or lack thereof, we're all called to love each other and care for each other. And in my opinion, what is climate change other than a failure to love?
And when you put it like that, it becomes even more imperative. Talk to me about your perception, at least anecdotally. You know, polling says climate change is lower on the food chain as far as people's concerns. But I find that when you actually talk to people, that they're really concerned about this. You know, that politicians don't tend to value it as much as the average person actually does, I think.
Yes, in fact, studies have shown, you know, there's many good efforts to capture public opinion, and the Yale Program on Climate Communication is one of those. And they study public opinion by county, by census tract, by congressional district, and they've shown that elected representatives consistently underestimate their own constituents' level of concern. Why do they? Well, this is really important. It's because on climate change, we self-silence.
What do you mean?
We don't talk about it. 2/3 of people in the US are worried about climate change. 1/3 of us hear somebody else even talk about it once in a blue moon. 2/3 worried, and then once in a blue moon, 1/3 of those people might hear a conversation. That's a huge gap, and it is a much bigger gap between the people who say that climate is or isn't changing, or isn't due to human activities. So you've got this giant group of worried people who aren't talking about it, so why would anybody know that you care if you never talk about it?
Wow. So
mind-blowing?
So that's why we're doing something like this, to get it into that conversation. You know, we've, at Today Climate, have found that this is so important, but not just talking about the problem, but the solution, solution-based. You know, we've done some stories about aquaculture, wineries and coffee, sustainability, because people love their coffee and they love their wine. You know, so we went to Puerto Rico to look at how they're trying to bring solar energy to the masses there. How do you find, as a scientist, what are the more successful ways of pushing out solution-based conversations?
Well, first of all, I think they're essential. And I mean, weren't you curious when you heard Al talk about that? Didn't you want to know more? I mean, you know, when someone says wine, what are they doing with that? I want to know. So you're making people curious, but you're also giving them hope. So often, so much of the climate conversation discussion happens up here. Facts, data, ocean currents, ice sheets. We have to make the connection from up here to down here. Why does it matter to me here and now, my community, my family, the things I care about? But then there's one more important connection we have to make, and that's from our heart to our hands. What do solutions look like? How can I make a difference? Because I mentioned earlier, 2/3 are worried, 1/3 talk about it once in a while, 8% are activated. 8%. Wow. I mean, the gap between the people who are already worried and the people who are activated, that's the gap we need to bridge.
Yeah.
And the number one way to bridge that gap is not by telling them more about how horrible it will be if the ocean currents shut down, and it will be terrible. But there's enough bad news already out there. It's telling them what they can do about it. And the number one way to build efficacy, which is a sense of if I do something, will it make a difference? It turns out the number one way to build that is to tell people what's already being done. And show them how normal, ordinary people, not presidents or CEOs or Mr. Beast, but just you, wherever you are, people like you are making a difference, and that means you can too.
where do, I mean, for some of us, we're already baked in, and a lot of people, but as far as young people are concerned, is that, in a sense, the future for affecting those solutions with climate?
Young people have such tremendous energy, and they don't say, like so many of us do, oh, well, that's been tried before, it didn't work, why bother, it's too hard. There's no such thing as too hard when you're young, and we need that energy. But we can't wait for them to fix it for us.
Right.
In fact, a global study that John Marshall at Potential Energy did, and John will be speaking at the end of the plenary this evening, a global study that he did around the world showed that most people are obviously worried about climate change, number one, but their motivation, their number one motivation for caring and acting is love, and it's often love for their children, the children in their life, the next generation. They're fighting for what is closest to their heart. So it isn't just a case of saying, let the young people lead us, as many of them are, rightly so, but it's also, we're doing it for the people we love.
Right. It's a great circle.
Yes.
In closing, how hopeful are you that we're going to be able to wrestle this thing and affect real change?
That's a great question. My answer depends on the day, obviously.
Honest, very honest.
As a climate scientist, you cannot be perennially hopeful because there are days when you just look at the information and the data and you look at how long we've known about it and you just feel like, my gosh, we knew about this before I was born. Why have we not done something about this? But what I do is I practice hope. I don't see hope as a feeling that just comes to you if you sort of sit there. If you go out and you hunt it down, and you look for it, and you find it, and you bring it back, and you share it with people around you, that to me is active, rational hope. And so I practice hope in a very disciplined way.
How?
I go out and I look for positive stories. And this is an example of, we have some amazing tools these days. Social media is a tool that is often used not for good, but we can use it for good to connect with people around the world and collect stories. And so I collect a lot of my stories online. There's a couple of good news subscriptions you can subscribe to. There's channels that have good news. I started my own newsletter last year called Talking Climate, where I share good news every week. I thought I was going to run out of good news every week. Now, a year and a half into it, I'm shoving 2 or 3 or 4 good news stories every week because I practice hope so rigorously. And when we see what's happening out there, we realize that giant boulder of climate action is not sitting at the bottom of an impossibly steep cliff with only Greta and Al Gore and Sir David Attenborough trying to push it up the cliff. If that was the way it was, we'd never get there. But when we realize...
I just want people to sit with that image for a moment.
I actually have a very vivid image in my head of that. But when we look around and we see what's happening, we realize that giant boulder is already at the top of the cliff. It's already rolling down the hill in the right direction. It has millions of hands on it. And if I add my hand, and if I use my voice to encourage others to add theirs, it's going to go faster. That's hope.
And that is the word according to Kathryn Hayhoe. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Al.
You are infectious. I love it.
Likewise.
This concludes our session on the stage. Please check the Aspen Ideas Climate app for the schedule and other updates. And don't forget to use the hashtag #AspenIdeasClimate to amplify the important conversations you've heard today.